Back when I was in high school, I attended a school in a fairly affluent district in Connecticut. Because of this, we had access to a variety of interesting field trips, especially if you were part of certain groups or activities. I was a member of the chorus, and every year we were offered one or two optional trips as a class. During my sophomore year, we went to a place called Woodloch Pines Resort in Pennsylvania. It was late November, so the area was quite cold and not very crowded, which added a layer of eerie silence to the entire experience. The trip was planned to last 3 days, with 4 chaperones accompanying us. Despite their presence, we were given a surprising amount of freedom to do our own activities, as long as we informed the chaperones of our whereabouts. I was rooming with my friend Ethan, and from the moment we arrived, we could tell it was going to be a quiet and possibly unsettling experience. The atmosphere at the resort was off, almost too quiet, and the few guests that were there seemed to keep to themselves, which only added to the strange feeling we both had. On the first day, Ethan and I, along with 2 girls we were friends with, spent time go-karting, rock climbing, and swimming. We finished the day with dinner and then returned to our room to hang out. Our room was on the ground level, with a sliding glass door that provided a clear view of the lake down the hill. The stillness of the lake and the cold November air made the scene outside our window feel almost otherworldly. The moonlight reflecting off the water was an incredible sight, so we decided to leave the blinds open, wanting to enjoy the view as we settled in for the night. Little did we know, this simple decision would lead to something terrifying. Around 11 p.m., we were both in bed, trying to get comfortable and falling asleep. The room was dark except for the soft light coming from outside. The stillness of the room was calming at first, but that calm was shattered when Ethan, whose bed was closer to the door, suddenly let out a scream. His voice was filled with terror, and I had no idea why he was screaming until I looked over at the sliding door. What I saw chilled me to the bone. Standing on the other side of the glass was an impossibly tall, thin woman with long, gray hair that seemed almost to float around her. Her face was pressed against the glass, her hands cupped around her eyes as if she was trying to peer inside. The sight was like something out of a nightmare, her eyes wide, almost unblinking as she stared into our room. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, without warning, she turned and walked away into the night, her figure disappearing into the darkness. Ethan and I were frozen in shock, our minds struggling to process what we had just seen. We waited, not daring to move, as if expecting her to return at any moment. When we finally did gather the courage to get up, we rushed outside to see if we could find her, but the path was empty. There was no sign of her anywhere, not on the trail, the grass, or down the hill. The cold night air stung our skin as we stood there, trying to convince ourselves that we hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But we both knew what we had seen, and the reality of it left us shaken. The next day, we told our 2 friends what had happened, but we didn't mention it to the chaperones. We didn't want to sound like we were making up stories, and part of us wanted to believe that it had been some sort of strange, one-time occurrence. That night, after another day full of activities, we made sure to close the blinds before going to bed. The memory of the woman's face was still fresh in our minds, and neither of us wanted to risk another encounter. Ethan fell asleep quickly, but I stayed awake a little longer, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The room was dark, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the trees outside. I kept glancing at the sliding door, half expecting to see the woman's face appear at any moment. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again, but when I did, the room was eerily silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making every little sound seem magnified. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and whispered Ethan's name. He didn't answer, so I turned to look at his bed, but I couldn't see him. Something was blocking my view. That's when I saw her. The tall woman was standing right next to my bed, looming over me like a shadow. Her presence filled the room with an almost tangible sense of dread. My heart stopped as she took 2 slow steps back, and then spoke in a voice that was both cold and hollow. "Your back door was unlocked." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she turned and walked out the sliding door, leaving it slightly ajar. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me as my mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't until I heard the soft creak of the door closing behind her that I snapped out of it. My hands were shaking as I reached over to wake Ethan. I told him what had happened, my voice barely above a whisper. We locked the door, shut the blinds, and sat in the dark, too terrified to sleep. We stayed up the rest of the night, the clock ticking agonizingly slowly as we waited for the first light of dawn. The next morning, after a sleepless night, we decided it was time to tell the chaperones about what had happened. But first, we needed to eat something. We went to the dining hall for breakfast, trying to shake off the exhaustion and fear that clung to us. When we returned to our room, what we saw made our blood run cold. The woman was back. She was sitting on the bed in the room next door, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight at us through the glass. Her eyes were locked onto us, unblinking, as if she had been waiting for our return. We didn't waste a second. We ran to the front desk and reported her to the staff instead of the chaperones, hoping that they would take the situation seriously. The staff seemed unsure of what to do, but after some convincing, they agreed to check the room with us. When they entered, they found the woman sitting exactly as we had seen her, along with an older man sitting on the other bed. Both of them had a disturbing, vacant look in their eyes, as if they weren't entirely present in the moment. The staff explained that the woman had some kind of mental disorder, but something about the man was equally unsettling. His eyes were dark and hollow, and there was an air of menace about him that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Despite our pleas, the staff refused to kick them out. They assured us that the woman was harmless and that there was no need to worry. But we knew better. Something about her wasn't right, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were in danger. We told the chaperones what had happened, and after a heated discussion with the resort staff, it was decided that we would cut the trip short and return home. Ethan and I were just relieved to be leaving that place behind. The memory of those 3 days still haunts me, and I'll never forget the look in that woman's eyes as she stared at us through the glass. When I was in 4th grade, my class took a field trip to a small rural zoo about an hour away from our school. The day was overcast, with occasional light rain, and the zoo itself was fairly modest, catering mostly to children with its smaller animal exhibits. There was also a large building within the zoo that housed taxidermied animals and other attractions that I can barely remember now. The zoo wasn't particularly crowded, and the gloomy weather only added to the eerie atmosphere. As a kid, I was a bit odd and socially awkward, something my teachers and even my mom noticed. I often found myself daydreaming or wandering off, lost in my own little world. During the tour of the building, while the rest of the class was busy looking at the displays, I decided to wander off without telling any of the teachers. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe I just wanted a moment of solitude, or perhaps I was just being my usual curious self. I went into one of the bathrooms, did my business, and when I came out, I realized I had lost track of the group. The building was dimly lit, with scarlet red carpets running down the hallways. The combination of the dim lighting and the eerie silence made the place feel like something out of a haunted house. The taxidermy animals in their glass cases only added to the unsettling vibe. Their lifeless eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by. As I wandered through the halls, trying to find my way back to the group, I suddenly noticed a man trying to hide behind a stack of chairs. At first, I thought he was playing a joke, maybe one of the staff members trying to have some fun with the kids. But then he stepped out from behind the chairs and started walking toward me. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked worn and dirty. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. He asked me where the group had gone, and when I told him I didn't know, he grabbed my hand and told me to follow him. Being a naive kid, I didn't resist, thinking he was just going to help me find my classmates. But instead of leading me back to the group, he took me to an exit door that led to a secluded area behind the building, near some dumpsters and the woods. The moment we stepped outside, his demeanor changed. The friendly, almost playful tone he had used before was gone, replaced by something darker and more sinister. His grip on my arm tightened, and he started pulling me toward the woods with a sense of urgency that set off alarm bells in my head. A wave of fear washed over me, but I was too scared to scream or cry out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, but all I could think about was the danger I was in. My stomach churned with dread, and I felt like I might throw up. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a voice pierced the air, a woman's scream, loud and desperate. It was one of the teachers on the other side of a fence that separated the zoo from the woods. She had spotted us and was yelling at the top of her lungs, calling for help. The man released me immediately, his grip loosening as he looked around in a panic. Without a word, he turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the trees. Moments later, several teachers came rushing out of the building, pulling me back inside and scolding me for wandering off, though they also tried to comfort me. They were visibly shaken by what had almost happened, and I could see the fear in their eyes as they tried to process the situation. They called my parents, and the field trip was abruptly ended. The zoo staff called the police, and we all boarded the buses to go home. The ride back was a blur. I was in shock, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The other kids on the bus were whispering to each other, casting curious glances in my direction, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was how close I had come to something terrible. As my bus pulled out of the parking lot, I happened to glance out the window, and that's when I saw him. The man was crouching in the woods near the road, hiding behind a branch and watching the buses leave. His eyes were locked onto me, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. I could feel his gaze following me as the bus pulled away, and I shivered, unable to look away. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I stayed quiet and didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Maybe I was too scared, too shy, or just too shaken up to speak. The memory of his eyes watching me from the woods haunted me for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for another opportunity. The rest of the ride home, the other kids kept giving me strange looks, but I didn't care. I was too lost in my own thoughts, replaying the events of the day over and over in my mind. When I finally got home, I didn't say a word to my parents about what had happened. I just went to my room and sat on my bed, staring out the window at the darkening sky. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, something dangerous and terrifying. I knew I had narrowly escaped something awful, and the thought of what could have happened kept me awake, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The next day, I returned to school, but I was different. The events of the field trip had changed me in a way I couldn't fully understand. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and the world seemed a little less safe than it had before. To this day, I still think about that man and wonder what would have happened if the teacher hadn't been there to save me. I hope he never succeeded in luring another child away like he almost did with me. Back in high school, I took a class that was all about real-life mysteries and strange occurrences. I can't remember the exact name of the class, but it was right up my alley. I loved anything that had to do with the unknown and the eerie. The class was a mix of history, folklore, and a bit of the paranormal, and it was unlike any other class I had ever taken. I was fascinated by the stories we learned about and the mysteries we tried to solve. I was taking the class with my friend Jake, and one day the teacher announced that we'd be going on a field trip to a nearby abandoned village with a mysterious past. The village had been built in the early 1900s, but for reasons unknown, it was quickly abandoned not long after it was established. The buildings had been left to decay, and the forest had slowly begun to reclaim the land. The bus ride there took about 20 minutes, and the closer we got, the more excited we became. We were glued to the windows, watching as the bus drove down a decrepit road cutting through a dense forest. The road was narrow and overgrown, with branches scratching against the sides of the bus as we made our way deeper into the woods. It felt like we were entering another world, a place forgotten by time. Eventually, we arrived at a clearing, and there it was, the abandoned village. The road was cracked and overgrown with grass, and the surrounding vegetation was almost knee-high. The buildings were tall, archaic structures made of brick, with boarded-up windows and an aura of decay that sent chills down my spine. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood, and the silence was almost oppressive. The teacher lined all 20 of us up, counted heads, and then led the way through the village. The purpose of the trip was to use the skills we learned in class to see if we could figure out why the village had been abandoned so suddenly. We were supposed to look for clues, anything that might hint at the village's past and the reasons behind its mysterious abandonment. Some of the buildings had gaping holes in the walls, which served as entryways, and there were even holes in the ground next to some of the structures, seemingly dug to access the basements. The buildings were in various states of disrepair, with crumbling walls and sagging roofs. It was clear that no one had set foot in this place for a very long time. There was one building that stood out to me more than the others. It was the tallest in the village, a towering structure that seemed to loom over the rest of the buildings. Something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the height or the fact that it seemed to be in slightly better condition than the others. Whatever it was, I felt a strong urge to explore it. While the teacher was leading the group toward the village church, Jake and I decided to sneak off on our own to explore the tall building. We figured we could catch up with the group later, and besides, we were both eager to see what secrets the building might hold. When we reached it, we found a hole in the ground by the back door, which had been sealed off. Inside the hole was a rusty ladder leading down to the concrete floor below. The ladder looked old and unstable, but our curiosity got the better of us. Jake went down first, carefully testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. I followed close behind, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. The basement was creepy, to say the least. The air was cold and musty, and the only light came from the weak beams of our foam flashlights. There were a few empty beer bottles scattered around, a graffiti tag on the wall, and dusty wooden planks covering parts of the floor. The walls were damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the space, adding to the eerie atmosphere. A wooden stairway led up to complete darkness, since all the windows and doors above had been boarded up. The stairs creaked under our weight, the old wood protesting with each step. We had already come this far, so we decided to continue exploring, even though every instinct was telling me to turn back. I went up the stairs first, each step making me feel as if I was walking on a tightrope, with the possibility of falling through at any moment. Jake followed close behind, his footsteps echoing mine. The floor above was cramped and labyrinthine, with narrow hallways leading off into smaller rooms. The darkness was so complete that it was hard to believe it was still daytime outside. Just as we were about to head back, we heard a noise, a loud thud, like a heavy rock hitting the concrete floor. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The sound had come from one of the small rooms off the main hallway. Instead of running, we tiptoed toward the source of the noise, our flashlights shaking in our hands. When we reached the doorway, we shined our lights into the room and were met with a horrifying sight. 3 men stood in a tight formation, facing us, their expressions blank and emotionless. They were dressed in old tattered clothes that looked like they had been worn for years. Their eyes were dark and hollow, and there was something unnatural about the way they were standing, as if they were waiting for us. Panic set in, and we bolted back down the stairs, climbing the ladder as fast as we could and racing outside. The cold air hit us like a wall, and we didn't stop running until we had rejoined the group. We were out of breath and too scared to explain what had happened. One of our classmates noticed our panic and asked what was wrong, but we didn't say much, just that we had gone into one of the buildings and seen something we couldn't explain. As the group continued exploring the village, Jake and I kept a close eye on the tall building from a distance. The fear of what we had seen weighed heavily on us, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Just before we left, I saw something that still haunts me to this day. A face peering out from one of the unboarded windows on a higher level. The face was pale and expressionless, just like the men we had seen in the room. We never told the teacher what we had seen, afraid of getting in trouble for sneaking off. We couldn't figure out who those men were, homeless people, gang members, or something even more sinister. Jake had his own theory that gave me chills. He believed they were the spirits of the village's former residents, still lingering in the place they once called home, trapped in the decay of a forgotten past. Whatever the truth is, the image of those 3 men standing there, silently watching us, is something I'll never forget. Their eyes, empty and lifeless, bore into my soul, leaving me with a sense of dread that still lingers to this day. Maybe one day I'll go back to that village, but for now, it remains a mystery I'm not eager to revisit. Love creepy stories? Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Our email is in the description. Please send in your horror stories.